I am here. I have the great privilege and honor of speaking with a good friend of mine. We've been friends for about, I think it's been, 5 years now. John David Ebert, who is a mythologist, cultural critic, and prolific author of many books like Celluloid Heroes and Mechanical Dragons, Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, and Art After Metaphysics. And we're here today to talk about his new book that is now out on Amazon called Giant Humans, Tiny Worlds, Adventures in the Universe of Graphic Novels. And this is a book that takes a look at mythology and incorporates a lot of postmodern philosophy and kind of dissects how that impacts the comic book and graphic novel universe. And John, one of the central themes you explore in your work is the idea that we've kind of lost communication with the gods, in a sense, and with the supernatural world, in favor for forging a kind of connection with the machine world, which has replaced our traditional spiritual value systems in a lot of ways. And this is something that the theorist and philosopher, great German philosopher Rudolf Steiner and mystic used to talk about in accepting kind of the dominating Ahrimanic, what he called the Ahrimanic influence on culture. And this is a concept that I get into in my own graphic novel, Kali Yuga. And I was just wondering if you could sort of unpack these ideas for us a little bit.
Sure, and also the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, too. Let's not forget that he continued in the realm of academic discourse. Steiner was marginalized from that realm. He started off as wanting to become a great German philosopher, but he could see into the spirit world too clearly to be accepted in that world. So when the Theosophists came along, he hooked up with them and found his audience, whereas Heidegger went strictly through the academic world, played by the rules. But basically, the two agree. The two agree on the same basic historical model that we have lost touch with the gods. We have lost certain psychological abilities to commune with them. For Heidegger, it would be the event of the clearing, wherein the gods unconceal certain entities, and the entities come out of the clearing, and then they dialogue with us. For Steiner, we get direct contact with these angelic presences that speak directly. They might speak in a vision, they might speak through our dreams. But now technology, for both philosophers, has come along and replaced all of that with a kind of ersatz, pale, degraded imitation, a kind of a Kali Yuga, if you were, age imitation of communicating with the deities. I can communicate with you via long distance because we have this gadget here inhabited by Ahrimanic beings that enable you and I to have a kind of an out-of-body experience. We're purely Platonic right now, one mind to another mind across vast distances. That's something that you could only do in the ancient world, if at all, if a couple of shamans who were good at astral body travel could travel outside their bodies and meet up somewhere. But we can replicate all of this electronically. So we've surrounded the entire planet with an electromagnetic sheath of satellites beaming information, the ghosts of dead celebrities, the images and sounds of old reruns on faded television shows. The whole planet is surrounded with what would have been in the ancient world regarded as ghosts, the ghosts of the dead, but also the living, disembodied voices of the living, transmitting at the speed of light. And so we're constantly, instead of being under observation of the eye of Horus, let's say, we're under the observation of the satellite eyes that were invented, by Howard Hughes back in the 1960s for the first geosynchronous satellites, which he helped put in orbit to make all of this possible. And so the history of technology, when you study it, and I think a lot of people who move into the field of specialization of technology do not study religious studies, much to their detriment, because they don't see the patterns that carry over. That technology basically carries over the same basic patterns and imprints that were there in the religious age and carries them right on into, as morphological structures, right on into the technological age. And so everything is the same as it was before, in a sense, except that just now it's technologized. So that's where we're at with that stuff.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I like that idea that we're sort of technology really allows us to kind of ignore our potential abilities with astral travel because it makes it just more convenient and more accessible for us. I like that very much. Well, okay, before we get into discussing your new book, I wanted to talk a little bit about your last book, Art After Metaphysics, which I believe was put out in November 2013, if I'm correct.
Oh, good.
And how do you feel like what is the sort of stature and role of art after metaphysics? And could you get into some of the ideas that you were writing about with this book?
Sure. I mean, after I finished the book called The Age of Catastrophe, I didn't want to go ahead with another book about catastrophe. I had planned on writing a book about violence at that point. So I didn't want to follow one downer with another. So I decided, well, what role does art have today? Let's look at that. What role does it have today? How is it constructing civilization? What aspects of it is it repairing and building back up? So I decided to look at contemporary art, which wasn't something that I knew a lot about. So in a sense that enabled me to get a fresh sort of eagle eye over it. And I sat down and I started reading biographies about Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko and Andy Warhol and Damien Hirst and people like that. And pretty soon I began to see that contemporary art constitutes an epoch that is very different from any of the epochs of art that have gone in the past. For one thing, it's post-metaphysical, which means to say that the metaphysical age is something that basically Heidegger made up, that extends from Plato to Nietzsche, let's say. Basically, what Derrida called the logocentric age. It's reason-centered and absolutely certain that there are these essences out there, and that the essences that are out there ground truth. The signifiers are sort of like the truths that are grounded in the absolute Platonic essences, so that there is a possibility of a philosopher of the ilk of Hegel, let's say, who writes his phenomenology of the spirit almost as a spiritual pilgrim traveling up Dante's, proverbial purgatorial mountain to get to the top. And at the top, when he gets there, instead of the white rose, he attains absolute knowledge because he's achieved what can be achieved, which is to uncover the grand ideas of the world spirit, that out of which the entire cosmos has been built, shaped, and structured. Those are the certainties of the metaphysical age, and artists operating during that age had a kind of perspectival view of art where you could only take one perspective, and that was it, one slice of visual, rational, Euclidean space. But then as modernism came along, of course, that space began to crumble and fall apart, and pretty soon you got hyperdimensional objects of the sort that you get in Picasso, in Duchamp's nude descending a staircase, and Bala's dog on the leash, and you can see its legs moving at 1,000 miles an hour. You get the hyperdimensional object, but it's still a metaphysical age metaphysic. Once you move out of that age, you're into the age of contemporary art, where the transcendental signifieds, God, freedom, soul, immortality, the subject, space and time itself, have all crumbled and are in a state of liquefaction. So with the crumbling and liquefaction of all the grand transcendental signifieds, the signifiers of contemporary art have nothing to stick to, as it were. It's like they're trying to stick something on a wall that's melting. And so there's no place to stick them. So what they have to do is each artist now has to construct his or her own semiosphere that's like a miniature model of an entire civilization's cosmology. And each and every single artist now has to do this. And in a certain sense, art in the contemporary epoch has become totally superfluous. The civilization no longer needs it, because the role that it used to play, the role that it played, let's say, in the time of Michelangelo and Leonardo, who were absolutely essential to the construction of civilization, because their art was a continuation of the classical Greek and Roman art, and was the essence of the revival of that and what that world was all about. That's all over and done with now. And the culture industry, Adorno's famous culture industry, all of that has taken over the role now that used to be played by art for the building of civilization. So contemporary art has been, along with contemporary philosophy, has been pushed aside and regarded as a kind of game for wasting one's time if one has the leisure and the money to do so. So the artist has become dangerously superfluous nowadays to the construction of civilization. But nonetheless, the key thing about this is that each artist is creating a miniature world, a kind of what Peter Sloterdijk calls a fomic world of multiple semiologies, multiple ontologies, and sooner or later one or another of them it's like natural selection, cosmological natural selection, one or another of them is going to be selected out to become the basis for the next world cosmology. Because this is the same thing that happened in the ancient world with the Christians. The Christians were simply one competing microcosmology amongst another, a whole bunch of other competing microcosmologies, and theirs was what got selected out because they managed to graft it onto the civic power structure of the Roman state. So it'll be interesting to see which of these cosmologies, if any of them, from contemporary art, and it may not come from contemporary art. It may come from a backwoods alien abduction cult, that gets elevated somehow to the status of a world religion. Either way, we're in a kind of an exciting age because we're living in a palaia, basically a meltdown of one age before the next age has come along. So there's a lot of stuff to channel surf.
And where do you see comics sort of in this greater sort of artistic palette? And what do you think about comics in general not being really taken very seriously as an art form? What inspired you to do a critical text that really looked at the serious mythological threads?
Well, they're not being taken seriously as a valid literary form. They're certainly not the first medium that later got taken seriously for that to happen. Film started that way, for instance. So did the ancient novel. A lot of people don't know this, that the Greeks invented the ancient novel, and it was regarded with scorn in the Hellenistic period, first couple of centuries A.D. It wasn't taken seriously. The major modes were epic, dramatic, and lyric. The novel wasn't considered one of those modes. And if you go back and you look at the handbooks of aesthetics from that period, Longinus's treatise on the sublime, let's say, or Horace's poetics, there's no mention of the novel in there. They were just regarded as a pop art form along with mime shows. And mime shows weren't the type of mime where you have a guy standing there pretending he's inside of a box. It was another word for a kind of short, quick theatrical sketch that was much more analogous to our television shows.
Sure.
And so those media were not taken seriously by the ancients. And in fact, the novel didn't get taken seriously as a medium until about the Middle Ages came along, and it became the new revelation with the chivalric romances and such. And then by the time you get to Don Quixote, it becomes the great medium that is selected out, and the epic is seen as something that is quaint and old-fashioned. Because once the scientific shift of the 17th century begins to take place, we're in the age of the here and now, the age of progress, and the age of the great ancestral beings, the giant humans, who are these two-dimensional monstrosities, like Thor, let's say, or any of the great superheroes from the Shahnama, Rostam, or the five Pandava brothers from the Mahabharata. Those characters are left over from an age where all the great culture forms were built at the beginning in illo tempore, as Michel Eliade puts it, and they set up all the culture forms to be complete and finished for all time at the beginning. And so the epics take place during a period when all the culture forms are fixed and done, and sometimes the primary plots will be how they struggle to bring that into being. But with the 17th century and the idea of progress and the idea that the world is not finished by God, but was left unfinished by God so that man could come along and finish it, the novel became the medium to select out, because the novel is set in the here and now, and it dispenses with the past. It's always set in the present, and it dispenses with two-dimensional humans, and there's always three-dimensional real people on the inside of them, and they're always engaged in constructing the utopian projects of modernity. And so the graphic novel picks right up from this. The graphic novel, too, is like the novel in that it's always set in the here and now, even if it's not, even if it's seems to be set in the distant past. It's always set in the here and now, but it differs from the novel in that there's a complete and total dystopian disenchantment with all the modernizing projects. They are regarded as all having failed, especially after World War II, which is the period of time when the comic book gets going, and then the graphic novel comes in the 1970s and really begins to pick up as kind of a disenchantment with the world bequeathed to us by post-modernity, where all the culture forms have failed. The family's in disintegration, the nation-state is in disintegration, and we've got all these tribal and ethnic war bands across the planet going to war against each other. None of the modernizing structures that were said to be put in place and fixed to hold society together as a kind of utopia have worked. And so the graphic novel operates within that space of disenchantment. But what it does is it retrieves also from the epic the giant two-dimensional humans and uses them as immune cells to construct a kind of personal immune system for the person reading the book. Initially, I think it was that the superheroes in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and even into the 60s were constructing the immune system for New York City. That was the primary thing. They were acting as immunological cells to keep astral spirits at bay Modernity wants nothing to do with the magical and mythical consciousness structures with